We have been busy preparing, as I'm sure you have, for the Feast of Tabernacles. We had our speakers meeting for Cortona, Italy this week, and I was driving around just a couple days ago looking for a place to get the brochure printed up. We are having to carry all those feast materials over in extra suitcases since we really don't want to rely on getting all that done over there. We do it here before we leave. And I got to counting. It's only 22 days before we all will be gathering together for the opening night of the Feast of Tabernacles. And like Mr. Mitchell, I will be giving a pre-feast message today. The sermons kind of go hand in hand in that way, but it is only 22 days. Perhaps that makes you smile, perhaps that makes you stress a little bit. I think it's a little of both for me because it's coming so quickly. But we will be gathering. Will we be ready? Are you ready to keep the Feast of Tabernacles? And I don't mean do we have all our plans in order? Do we have our travel plans, our maps, our GPS devices set and ready? Do we have our flight plans to go wherever we're going? I mean, are we ready to observe the feast in the way that God asks us, actually commands us to do so? If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 16, we find the instruction there about keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 13. We find some particular verbiage in a number of places with regard to observing the feast. We see that here in Deuteronomy 16, verse 13. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days when you have gathered from your threshing floor and your winepress. And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates. In other words, it is a calling together of everyone, of the community, the family, to come together and to rejoice. It says, 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God in the place where the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your work of all your hands, and you shall surely rejoice. So we are commanded there to rejoice. Now, Mr. Franks wrote a note to all the ministry this week, and he made the comment at the beginning of his note. He said, "It's always seemed strange to me that we're commanded to rejoice during the Feast of Tabernacles. Rejoicing is generally something that comes naturally when we have a pleasurable experience. Yet God doesn't leave it to us to determine if we will be happy or not. He commands us to be happy, to rejoice." It does seem a little strange that we would be commanded to rejoice, because doesn't rejoicing come easy? Isn't that the case? Rejoicing just comes easy. We love to rejoice. If you go back to Leviticus 23, the Holy Day chapter there, it again uses the same verbiage in Leviticus 23. I will skip through the first part of it, speaking of the Feast of Tabernacles. But it says in verse 40, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And so over and over we have this idea of rejoicing. Is it really something we need to be commanded to do? I mean, if you think about it from the Israelites' perspective, they had their wine, their fresh wine, they had the harvest was in, they had abundance to eat. In one sense, it seems natural that eating and enjoying wine together would be something they would experience that time of year. But there's really more to it than that, this idea of rejoicing. Why do we do it? Is it just the concept of enjoying ourselves because God wants us to enjoy the wine and the food, the company? Well, that's part of it. But is there something deeper to the concept of rejoicing? And why do we have to be told to do it? Is it more than just being told to enjoy ourselves for our own benefit? Is there something more to that? I think we'll see that as we do go through that today. And think about it this way as well. Someone asks you to come over, perhaps this evening, and enjoy a card game or some fellowship, and you know that you're going to go over to their place and you're going to be happy. You're going to be glad. You're going to rejoice. And it perhaps is something easy to do during the course of an evening. Put your troubles aside. We're going to a friend's house to enjoy the evening. But 7 days and then an 8th day? To rejoice that long? Is that really something that comes easy? We live in a society that is full of depression, anxiety. Many people have to take medication to control anxiety and depression. Can we go 8 days really rejoicing? Is it natural to do? Is it really that easy? I think when we think about it, perhaps it's not as easy as it seems. After all, as we're planning to go to the feast, perhaps you're going to throw your several children into the car, not literally, but put them in there. And you know that as you start off for the feast, the kids are going to be singing, complimenting each other on their voices, sleeping when they're supposed to be sleeping. And the trip's just going to go amazingly well because it is, after all, God's Feast of Tabernacles. You are going in faith. Nothing can happen to the car. There cannot be a delay in your flight. Surely your bags will not go missing because it is God's Feast of Tabernacles. Isn't that the way it always goes? You know, we of course, we know that is not the case. But sometimes perhaps we wonder, why can't it be that way? It is God's feast. We are going in faith. We are obeying. Why does it seem like sometimes whatever can go wrong does go wrong? And how on earth can we rejoice when these things happen? You see, rejoicing isn't always as easy as it might initially seem. So today I'd like to talk about the concept of what is rejoicing. What is it? Why do we do it? Why do we really do it? Is it just something so we can just enjoy ourselves? And I want to talk about how. How can we do it, especially when it seems there are so many obstacles to rejoicing for 7 or 8 days? First of all, this concept of rejoicing in the Hebrew really isn't any different than our concept today. The idea is to be joyful, to be glad. These are concepts that go right along with our word rejoice, to delight in an occasion or something. It's something that, as I said, we love to rejoice, but it's not always easy to do. Part of that is because Satan knows that we are commanded to rejoice. Satan knows it. And I don't suggest that every single thing that happens to us that's negative is a result of Satan causing it to happen. Perhaps he can. I'm not saying it's not, but I don't think every single negative thing is a result of Satan making something happen to trip us up. But I do think that Satan takes advantage of those things that happen to us to influence us to think negatively, to be overwhelmed, if you will, by the things that are going on, the physical circumstances. I think Satan does try to influence us to be overwhelmed by those things. He tries to influence us to not rejoice, to focus on the negativity. And that can be very powerful influence on us if we're not ready, if we're not ready to deal with those things. If you go back to Matthew chapter 13, verse 22, we see one of the ways that Satan does attack, or one of the ways that we are attacked. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22, we'll just pick up in the middle of this parable here. It says, and when he who received the seed among thorns, he who received the seed among thorns is he who hears the word. We hear the word, don't we? We hear the command to rejoice. But it says, but the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. Of course, we know this parable is speaking in terms of people hearing the truth of God, but I'm looking at it in terms today of just us hearing the word rejoice. Why is it so difficult sometimes? Because the cares of this world creep in. After 8 days at the feast, it's hard not to think about some of the things that maybe we'll face back home, some of the things that we faced before we went to the feast, some of the problems we run into when we get to our site and we see that perhaps the place we rented isn't exactly the way it's portrayed on Airbnb or whatever. It doesn't smell like it smelled when I looked at it on the screen. We have problems that we run into when we get there. And Satan, again, tries to cause us to react to those in a certain way, in a very negative way. I think it can be very helpful to pray to God before we go to the feast to help us to have joy, that fruit of the Spirit. In fact, in Galatians 5, verse 22, it mentions all the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. It's probably a good idea to pray for all of those things as we go to the feast. Because again, Satan will do his best to trip us up. And we are told by God that we are to rejoice. That is to be what we do. How can we do it? We need to be on guard because Satan certainly will try to trip us up in that way. Let's go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, if you will. Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse, we'll start reading in verse 16. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 16. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child. Woe to you when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. The idea is here is they're just feasting, getting drunk in the morning, staying drunk all day. That's the concept of some people's idea of rejoicing. I think this world, when they see the idea of rejoicing, let's go somewhere and rejoice, it's about having a party. That's certainly not what God expects of us. Notice verse 17, Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength, not for drunkenness. There is a kind of feasting that we can partake of that strengthens us, that brings us together, unifies us, and that enhances our experience at the feast. There's also a kind of feasting that the world does that does not do that. It brings us together for selfish reasons. And we are being asked to come together for the feast. And notice verse 19, a feast is made for laughter. Laughter is a part of rejoicing. It's so wonderful. I know we all have experienced that at the Feast of Tabernacles. We go, everyone's excited to be there. And there is sharing of stories, meeting old friends, and there is laughter. A feast was made for laughter. It is to be a joyful occasion. It says wine makes merry. Of course, we recognize that we go to the feast. We are commanded to partake in whatever our heart desires, perhaps wines that are a little finer than we're used to, steaks that are a little tastier than we're used to. That's all part of feasting. Notice it goes on to say, but money answers everything. Now, this kind of throws a loop in the whole thing. Some translations say, and money answers everything. And the commentators have different ideas about what this is meant, what is meant by this. Obviously, it doesn't mean that money answers everything in the sense of everything you can think of. We know very rich people who die. Money doesn't get them to live forever. Money doesn't answer everything. But when it comes to feasting, money helps. If you're a king and you're going to throw a feast, having the money to have all the meat and the wine and the breads for all the people you're inviting, money helps. And I think for the Feast of Tabernacles, I think God knows this point. I mean, in a sense of a worldly way, to enjoy feasting in the world, there's a certain amount of money that helps. That's why we save our second tithe. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 14, God has provided a way for us to feast in a way that is really, it's a more rich feast than we can have in our day-to-day lives because we have saved a tenth of our yearly income. And so we have more available over those 8 days. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 22 says, and you shall truly tithe of the increase of your grain, of the field that the field produces year by year. You shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. The tithe of your grain, of your new wine, your oil, of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So there's a purpose to this feasting and learning to fear God. It says, and if your journey is too long for you, and you're not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money, and take the money in your hand, and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, and similar drink. Whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part or inheritance with you. So we're commanded again to rejoice with that second tithe. And notice it also says not to forsake those who may not have the abundance that we have. I think that's an important part. Going back to Ecclesiastes 10, money answers everything. If you're at a feast, certainly money helps. And for those, particularly those who may be receiving assistance from the church, they have enough to go to the feast to enjoy it. But they may not have enough to eat at some of the fancy restaurants. They won't have that kind of money. And if we are able to invite someone who may not have quite as much to enjoy a very fine meal that they wouldn't be able to with their own funds, that's a way that we can share, that we can genuinely contribute to someone else's Feast of Tabernacles. Because it is a feast, and to feast does take second tithe. It does take some funds in order to make that happen for all of us. Now, why? Why does God command us to rejoice? Again, is it just so we can enjoy ourselves? Or is there something more to that? If we go back to Proverbs chapter 29, Proverbs 29, verse 2, this gets into the reason, the ultimate reason, I think, as to why we are asked to rejoice. There's a spiritual reason to it. Rejoicing can be a very physical thing, but there's a spiritual reason behind it as to why this is so important in the Feast of Tabernacles. Why will people rejoice in the millennium? We're there to commemorate the reign of Jesus Christ. Why will people rejoice at that time? Rejoicing is something that will be an integral part of what happens in the millennium. It says in Proverbs 29, verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. Well, Satan's going to be taken out of the picture, the ruler of the world today. Christ is going to come on the throne, and the righteous, the one of all righteous, will reign. And that reign will cause rejoicing. And part of what we are doing when we rejoice at the feast is we are commemorating the kind of spirit and attitude we will see in the millennium. We are joining in with what will happen in the millennium. If you turn back to Isaiah chapter 25. There's a great deal of rejoicing that's going to begin to happen in the millennium as Christ rules. Isaiah 25, verse 6, it says, and in this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast. God is going to create a feast for everyone. It says, of choice pieces or meats, a feast of wine on the lees, of fat things of marrow, well-refined wines on the lees. If any of you are going where Alan's going for the feast, remember Isaiah 25. The wine is on the lees. And just remember, I would do that if I were you, going to the feast with the lees there. Actually, that means the wine on the lees means that it's properly aged. It is a fine wine. And so it's very, very enjoyable to drink. But God is going to throw this feast. He's going to have ultimately a feast for the entire world. They are going to be able to feast and keep the feast because Jesus Christ rules. What a wonderful time. It will be a time of rejoicing. And so our rejoicing at the feast is more than just showing how we feel. It's more than enjoying fine physical food and wine and sightseeing and shopping. It's more than physical. It is a kind of act of faith. Rejoicing is a kind of act of faith. It is a demonstration of our faith in the reality of the coming kingdom. A demonstration of our faith in the reality of the coming kingdom. We will rejoice. We will be commemorating a time when the world can begin to have joy and peace and prosperity. And so there is a spiritual reason why we rejoice. It's not just for our own feeling good. it is because the world will rejoice at that time. We are, in a way, bearing witness to the world, to those around us, to each other, and we're bearing witness to Satan that we know that Jesus Christ is going to return, that his kingdom is going to be set up, and it is going to change the world. It is a demonstration that we believe that will be happening, and we're partaking of it even today. It is truly a celebration of a future event that hasn't happened yet, as we rejoice. In another way, we rejoice for the world. They don't understand the feast. They don't understand the millennium. They don't understand the truth that we understand, and they're not able to rejoice today. Look at the problems that exist in the world all around us. In one sense, it's hard to rejoice when we see all the problems. But just remember, we're projecting ourselves into the future, when all those people who are suffering today will not be suffering anymore. And that's part of the reason we rejoice. We rejoice for them and what they will experience in the future and what we'll have a part in helping them along. Rejoicing in that sense is a symbol. The whole world will rejoice together. And so I think that when we think about it this way, we see why God commands it. Rejoicing is a huge part of what will happen in the millennium. We are celebrating that time. Therefore, we emulate that. We emulate that by rejoicing ourselves. Let's turn back to Jeremiah chapter 31, if you will. A prophecy about the rejoicing that will take place during the millennium. Jeremiah chapter 31, and we'll pick up reading in verse 10 through 14. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He who scattered Israel will gather them, and keep them as a shepherd does his flock. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob, and ransomed him from the hand of the one stronger than he. Therefore they shall come and sing in the heights of Zion, streaming to the goodness of the Lord, for wheat and new wine and oil, for the young of the flock and herd. Your souls shall be like a well-watered garden, and they shall sorrow no more at all." So this is a prophecy about Israel being gathered back together, and God fulfilling his promise to that nation. It says, "Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, and the young men and old together. For I will turn their mourning to joy, will comfort them, and make them rejoice rather than sorrow." That is a promise that God has in looking forward. That not only the nation of Israel, the descendants of Israel, will be called together, and God will establish an environment where they can rejoice, but ultimately, as we know, the entire world. And ultimately, on that eighth day, everyone who's ever lived, given an opportunity to be resurrected, to live God's way, to choose to follow him, and to usher in that time of rejoicing as well. I think it's a wonderful time, and it's a wonderful spiritual reason to rejoice. By doing so, we are fulfilling what these days picture. But still, how can we do it? Really, how can we do it? I want to have us consider our state of mind as we go into the feast, because how we think about things really impacts how much we rejoice or how much we feel like rejoicing. And as I said, it's not just how we feel, we're commanded to do it, but our approach and our attitude toward what we're about to experience really makes a difference. I want to read to you a letter. This is actually an article that contains a letter in it, but it's an article that appeared back in the 1982 Good News Magazine, and it's a story of one particular man. I'll just start off by reading the story. Here it's by Art Dockin. It says, "The barracks was a long, narrow room with a door on one end and a single window on the other. Bare, unpainted wooden walls and worn, splintered floorboards made the room about as inviting as a county jail. Ancient cots, 10 to 15 of them, sat perpendicular to the wall. Equally aged pads served as mattresses on a single threadbare blanket lay on each bed, to be used to ward off the near-freezing night chill. What few belongings each of the occupants possessed were hung from nails that were driven into the wall. The common toilet was in another building down a muddy street. The shower room was still the other direction. The floor and one wall of the shower were concrete, and out of the wall protruded several pipes which poured water of one temperature, cold. Of course, there was no heat in any of the rooms. Sound like a prisoner of war camp? A young man who lived under these conditions wrote our office in Manila, Philippines, some years ago, and described his feelings toward his days in that camp. He wrote this: "I thank God for making it possible for me to attend the Feast of Tabernacles." He wrote, this was, he said, the first time he had ever slept on a real bed, the first time he had ever used a shower. It was also the first time he had ever eaten 3 balanced meals in one day, fellowshiped with God's people, sang psalms, heard a choir singing praises to God, or listened to a minister of God preach a sermon. Yes, the young man described his first Feast of Tabernacles in Baguio City, Philippines. Drab barracks, cold showers, sparse meals, the rather inexperienced choir, and even the speakers were all something rare and wonderful to him. Now, he declared, "I know what the world tomorrow will be like. I can imagine how wonderful it will be." What a perspective. I mean, it's just shocking to think that someone could go, experience those conditions that we would by no means think were acceptable to our standards, but yet he now knows what the world tomorrow will be like. It's all perspective, isn't it? It's all perspective. God does not tell us that we won't have problems at the feast. He doesn't say that we will rejoice because we have no problems. Certainly this young gentleman, Baguio City, he thought it was a magnificent thing that he could be there, observing that, even in those conditions. A little later in the article, it says the first year of the Feast of Tabernacles in Baguio City, a typhoon raged through the Philippines. Roads were washed out, airports closed, electrical power was cut. Half of the members were unable to even reach Baguio City. That opening night service, they had no electricity. The minister stood in a room filled with candles. There were a few flashlights that showed up on him so that people could see him and he could see his notes. And it says that he read from Leviticus 23, verse 40. He put special emphasis on the words, "And you shall rejoice before the Lord 7 days." He said, "Brethren, God commands us to rejoice, so we're going to rejoice in spite of everything." How could they rejoice? Well, because they understood the feast pictured a better world tomorrow. They realized that the feast looked to the future, that it didn't focus on today's problems. I think it's a wonderful story that appeared in the magazine back in 82 because it helps us get a perspective. If we recognize that we truly are blessed, we don't deserve it. It's because of God's blessings that we have what we have. And whatever we have when we get to the feast, it's a blessing to be at the feast. We can rejoice not because of the problems we experience today, but because we look forward to a world where there won't be those kind of problems. And we look forward to rejoicing with all the world and the rest of the world in that time. Let's go back to Romans chapter 8, verse 18 in this context, because usually we read Romans 8, verse 18 in a different context. Usually we read it in the context that it's intended. I'm going to read it just in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles today. Where Paul says, I suppose that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. You know, we think about the troubles we might experience going to the feast or at the feast. They truly are not worthy to be compared with the glory that's going to be evident to all when Christ rules this earth. And as we project ourselves forward, we think about that, what it means to not only us, but to all humanity, how can we do anything but rejoice? There is a spiritual reason for that rejoicing. So again, 22 days from now, you and I will be gathering to rejoice. We are commanded to be glad, to rejoice. And I think it's helpful to understand why that rejoicing is important and how we can do it, even when things are not always perfect. We don't just hope to rejoice. We don't just plan to rejoice. We don't just see it as an ideal. We see it as something God commands us to do because it pictures something. We're rejoicing for a reason. Everything doesn't just have to work out right. We're not there just to have a good time. Our rejoicing is based on a spiritual attitude, not a physical circumstance. It is a celebration looking forward to something that only God and His church recognizes today, but the whole world will at that time. So let's be prepared to go to the feast to fulfill God's command to rejoice. We certainly shall rejoice.